Module 4, Relational Summary, Lecture GSP2, Subaltern Studies. Perhaps you've never heard of subaltern studies. Don't despair too much. Living in the political north, I hadn't heard of it either until I got to graduate school and started digging into environmental and social justice. We aren't really supposed to engage in subaltern studies if we want to keep the profit by exploitation machine going, right? They explain a lot, however, and they started in the political South. Let's turn to Wiki to get an idea of this movement and its power to inform. The Subaltern Studies Group, SSG, or Subaltern Studies Collective, is a group of South Asian scholars interested in the post-colonial and post-imperial societies. The term subaltern studies, is sometimes also applied more broadly to others who share many of their views, and they are often considered to be, quote, exemplary of post-colonial studies, and as one of the most influential movements in their field. Their anti-essentialist approach is one of history from below, focused more on what happens among the masses at the base levels of society than among the elite, end quote. More specifically, according to California State University Long Beach, subaltern studies, quote, emerged around 1982 as a series of journal articles published by Oxford University Press in India. A group of Indian scholars trained in the West wanted to reclaim their history. Its main goal was to retake history for the underclasses, for the voices that had not been heard previously. Scholars of the subaltern hoped to break away from the histories of the elites and the Eurocentric bias of current imperial history, end quote. Another entry unites subaltern studies and post-colonial studies. Quote, in post-colonial studies and in critical theory, the term subaltern designates and identifies the colonial populations who are socially, politically, and geographically excluded from the hierarchy of power of an imperial colony and from the metropolitan homeland of an empire. Antonio Gramsci coined the term subaltern to identify the cultural hegemony that excludes and displaces specific people and social groups from the social economic institutions of society in order to deny their agency and voices in colonial politics, end quote. Another quote. The term subaltern and subaltern studies entered the vocabulary of post-colonial studies through the works of subaltern studies groups of historians who explored their political actor role of the men and women who constitute the mass population, rather than re-explore the political actor roles of the social and economic elites in the history of India, end quote. So of course you haven't heard of it. Maybe you've heard the term hegemony, leadership or dominance, especially by one country or social group over others. And maybe you understand how cultural hegemony can exclude people from a conversation or from being considered when policies are being made. But it's doubtful most of you, particularly if you're white, have ever felt the true impact of having your voice and agency taken away. The subaltern voice, like it or not, the global South political voice, is overwhelmingly of color, and is a voice that cries out, our lives matter. You're hearing a bit more about it now in college settings because police brutality and injustice against blacks in particular has been impossible to ignore. But in the purest sense of the term, the experience of the American black who lives completely enmeshed in the cultural political north, for better or for worse, is technically within the hegemonic discourse. The feminist scholar Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak cautioned against an overbroad application of the term subaltern, saying, quote, just by being a discriminated against minority on the university campus, they don't need the word subaltern. They should see what the mechanics of the discrimination are. They're within the hegemonic discourse, wanting a piece of the pie and not being allowed. So let them speak, use the hegemonic discourse, but they should not call themselves subaltern, end quote. See, subaltern really is meant more for those who were never integrated into the culture and economy of the North, often referred to as the West, but in this course we've chosen to give Western to the voices of the people west of Europe before the Europeans colonized it. So though college may teach you about injustices done to people based on racism and fascist outlooks, you still don't hear much about environmental injustice as it affects the people of the political solar South. And when you do, there's rarely any attention paid to the learnings and teachings of those who are impacted by the injustice. So-called higher education is still mainly the story of the hegemon, and all interpretations of justice and injustice are filtered through Eurocentric eyes. The wonderful Italian scholar Gramsci, who coined the phrase subaltern, who was imprisoned by Mussolini for his anti-fascist views, is still a European inviting you to explore the impact of colonialism, not a victim of colonialism. And colonialism, which has been sanitized by schools and history books, its brutality justified through comedic skits like Monty Python's "What have the Romans ever done for us?", was a blatant form of fascist control, the purest example of centuries, not mere decades of fascism. As the French Martinique writer, poet, and politician Aimé Césaire commented in his 1955 discourse on civilization. Through his eyes, we get a different perspective on the shock Europe felt when the Nazis took power, believing what had happened to the colonized could never happen to them. Quote, "People are surprised, they become indignant, and then they wait and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves that it is barbarism, but the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had been applied only to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack." End quote. This is an article about the brutal friendship between colonialism and fascism, some thoughts from Aimé Césaire. Powerful words from a subaltern voice, a voice you don't get in your mainstream education because you are, by and large, still hearing it from people like me, hence hearing it secondhand. Where you can't have a truly human encounter with the author. You can't see the sadness or the fear in his or her eyes, the trembling lip as she tells her story. You can't feel the tension in her shoulders, sense the sweat on her brown brow. Without the subaltern presence, we're just telling stories in our supposed education system, and we're exploring ideologies, not developing a true understanding of what's at stake with environmental degradation, with inequality, and with climate change. Despite the protestations of groups I call pseudo-conservatives, college educations aren't radical at all. They may be called left-biased every time we open young people's eyes to an alternative view of the world, but we don't trade in alternative facts, whatever those are. We basically toe the Eurocentric imperialist capitalist line. You hardly hear a whisper of Marx and Engels' ecological economics or their theory of the metabolic rift that explains so much of why the circular economy is so hard to achieve with current practices and thoughts about sustainability. Marx is taboo, after all. But even those who dare to follow the great geographer, scholar, and critic David Harvey from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York down the Marxian rabbit hole, you won't depart much from the Eurocentric bias that the lion's share of university education propagates, even when we descendants of the architects of that bias strain to include the perspectives of the other and to sign Edward Said's classic Orientalism. Unless you meet with professors and scholars who really are themselves subaltern, you're at best going to get a well-intentioned roadside anthropology tour of the other 90%, interpreted and sanitized for you by us, the dominant 10%, the inheritors of the imperialist history's spoils of war. I wasn't truly aware of how tainted I was by my university education until I actually went to India for the first time in 2009 to tour the country in solar, electric, and biodiesel support vehicles with the solar-powered rock band Solar Punch as part of the India Youth Climate Network initiative. At one point in our journey, we ended up at the Barefoot College for Engineering in Rajasthan, where we performed with their staff and students who have been integrating music, dance, poetry, puppetry, and improvisation in their engineering and sustainability science programs for decades. Just as you've probably never heard of the subaltern studies that started in India, you've probably never heard of Barefoot College. You've heard of Harvard and Oxford and the Sorbonne, I'm sure. Maybe King's College and possibly the esteemed India Institute of Science, where artificial photosynthesis was invented and which has been in the news because of environmental sustainability achievements like quote, a method to mass produce trees from test tubes, pitching a sustainable water resource development strategy for Bengaluru and Mangaluru, restoring a 10,000-acre forest with a drone and seed bombs, among others, end quote, according to the article IISC Turns 110, 5 Reasons Why the Indian Institute of Science is Iconic for India. See, these are conventional colleges in the northern political, mentally derived Eurocentric mold, no matter where they're found in the world today. But Barefoot is a true subaltern success story. As Wiki reports it, quote, the Social Work and Research Center, SWRC, widely known as the Barefoot College, is a voluntary organization in India working in the fields of education, skill development, health, drinking water, women's empowerment, and electrification through solar power for the upliftment of rural people, which was founded by Bunker Roy in 1972. The Villagers Barefoot College in the village of Talonia gives lessons in reading, writing, and accounting to adults and children, especially the, quote, dropouts, cop-outs, and washouts. Girls heavily outnumber boys in the night schools. In 2008, there were approximately 3,000 children attending 150 night schools. In the profile acknowledging Roy as one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people for his work with the Barefoot College, Greg Mortensen wrote that the grassroots social entrepreneurship has trained more than 3 million people for jobs in the modern world in simple, sustainable settings that accommodate the students' needs, end quote. When I got there in 2009, Bunker told us that the focus of the college had become educating women between 30 and 65 years of age from all over the political South and the subaltern world. Governments as far away as Sudan and Senegal and South Africa, Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador were sending rural village women who had already had children on fully paid scholarships to India to learn how to solder and assemble electronic boards for solar lanterns and wire together photovoltaic solar panels, how to weld together iron frames to build solar Scheffler mirrors for fume and fuel-free cooking, how to build biodigesters to eliminate the threat of childhood diseases and water contamination, how to grow food without dirt and without pesticides, and a ton of other practical sustainability techniques that they were expected to return home with and teach the rest of their communities. They were chosen to be at an age when they could leave their children with the grandparents or with other family members, and to have the experience and wisdom as mothers to care about the future of their region. The adage they followed is one I learned in the Rainforest Eco Escuela in the Petén region of Guatemala, where I spent a summer in an intensive sustainability Spanish course. Give a man a fish, and he will sell it and use the money to buy booze. Teach a man to fish, and he'll quit early and go get drunk. Teach a woman to fish, and she will teach her man and her children and the entire community and organize fishing trips and go fishing herself, and everybody will be well fed. That is subaltern humor at its best. After a delightful day sharing our solar-powered songs about solar power and listening to the women perform in multiple languages their detailed, self-composed song and puppet shows about how to build solar cookers and what their benefits are, used by the women back home to help teach others, particularly those who are illiterate, I ended up in Bunker Roy's study, having a carafe of wine until 2 a.m., talking educational philosophy. At one point, because I was so enthusiastic about what we had experienced in our days there, I flat out asked Bunker for a job. He smiled sadly. I very much admire you and what you do, he said, and I would love to have you work with us, but there are several problems. The first is that you're male. That in itself isn't a terrible thing, after all, I'm male. But we have been focused now on only hiring local males from the village and otherwise building our teaching staff with women who have experience in this field. We need more women teaching engineering. And then there is the fact that you've been poisoned. We're only hiring now people who didn't have formal education in orthodox institutions of so-called higher learning, and thus can truly relate to our students. You come from America. Your training was at colleges like Harvard and UCLA, and so despite your very laudable efforts to relearn the world and see it through others' eyes, you can't help but be biased by your upbringing. Where some institutions look at your degrees as extremely valuable for a sustainability teaching job, our policy is to look at them with extreme prejudice, as indicators that you suffered through that formal education process of brainwashing against environmental and social justice and true sustainability that it is extremely hard to break free from. It will take you decades to unpack all the garbage that you were fed and purge it from your system. And I say this with great love and admiration. My great hope is that you will take a teaching position in one of those so-called top universities in your own country and help reform them. Bring the techniques we've proven work so well here at the Barefoot College to your home and your dysfunctional culture, and make sustainability education really work there too. Because you can. You, unlike so many others, actually do know how. Needless to say, it was one of the most sobering conversations and caring employment rejections I've ever had. And I followed Bunker's advice to the letter, because he also said, if you can teach the Barefoot College way in Europe and America, you will be working with us, working to make the world a better place. So in a sense, I feel I am very much working for the Barefoot College right here at PCGS. And much of that work is helping spread the perspective of subaltern studies. I want to open your eyes to the work of leaders in the field like Ibrahim Frantz Fanon, the French West Indian psychiatrist and political philosopher from the French colony of Martinique, who wrote the classic 1961 book, The Wretched of the Earth, describing how marginalized and conquered people are so often deliberately driven to violence. There are other important names that you should know that have probably been eclipsed from your cognition or washed out of your brain if you ever encountered them as tiny signals in the wash of noise coming from a society that celebrates celebrity and takes over your limited consciousness by making the do-nothing for nobody but themselves Kardashians household names. In our brains, Kim Kardashian crowds out truly great women like Wangari Maathai, the renowned Kenyan social, environmental, and political activist and the first African woman to win the Nobel Prize. In 1977, did you know Maathai founded the Green Belt Movement, an environmental non-governmental organization focused on the planting of trees, environmental conservation, and women's rights? In 1984, she was awarded the Right Livelihood Award for converting the Kenyan ecological debate into mass action for reforestation. What did Kim Kardashian ever do to make your life better or to help tackle climate change? Oh, that's right, I forgot. On January 3rd of 2020, she tweeted, "Climate change is real," despite being married to Kanye West, who was great buddies with climate denial leader Donald Trump and started a run for his own presidency and wanted Kim to be America's first lady. Yeah, tweeting is a form of mass action, right? For socialites and their sycophants, I suppose it is. But now do you see what Bunker Roy was trying to tell me? If I were to teach in India, I would be yet another white man from the land of the hegemon. You could call me the hedge man, hedging my bets about how to maintain privileges in an ever more competitive world by moving to a place where the post-colonialist era still buffers me from ever falling into poverty, taking on the falsely and hideously defined white man's burden, bringing the poison of my privilege to infect the other in the name of European or Euro-American enlightenment. This is the topic of Kaylee Gould's TED Talk, The White Savior Complex, the Dark Side of Volunteering. I would be complicit in the damage that Monsignor Ivan Illitch, the Austrian philosopher and Catholic priest living in Mexico in the 1960s, claimed that the Peace Corps was doing in his famous 1968 essay, "To Hell with Good Intentions," a reflection on international service. He said, and quite famously, though you may never have heard of him either, "I am here to challenge you to recognize your inability, your powerlessness, and your incapacity to do the good which you intend to do. It is quite possible that the hypocrisy is unconscious in most of you. Intellectually, you are ready to see that the motivations which could legitimate volunteer action overseas in 1963 cannot be invoked for the same action in 1968. Mission vacations among poor Mexicans were the thing to do for well-off US students earlier in this decade. Sentimental concern for newly discovered poverty south of the border, combined with total blindness to much worse poverty at home, justified such benevolent excursions." He continued, "I do have deep faith in the enormous goodwill of the US volunteer. However, his good faith can usually be explained only by an abysmal lack of intuitive delicacy. By definition, you cannot help being ultimately vacationing salesmen for the middle-class American way of life, since that is really the only life you know. A group like this could not have developed unless a mood in the United States had supported it. It's a belief that any true American must share God's blessings with his poorer fellow men. The idea that every American has something to give and at all times may, can, and should try to give it explains why it occurred to students that they could help Mexican peasants develop by spending a few months in their villages. Of course, this surprising conviction was supported by members of a missionary order who would have no reason to exist unless they had the same conviction, except a much stronger one. It is now high time to cure yourselves of this. You, like the values you carry, are the products of an American society of achievers and consumers, with its two-party system, its universal schooling and family car affluence. You are ultimately, consciously or unconsciously, salesmen for a delusive ballet in the ideas of democracy, equal opportunity, and free enterprise among people who haven't the possibility of profiting from these. Next to money and guns, the third largest North American export is the US idealist, who turns up in every theater of the world. The teacher, the volunteer, the missionary, the community organizer, the economic developer, and the vacationing do-gooders. Ideally, these people define their role as service. Actually, they frequently wind up alleviating the damage done by money and weapons, or seducing the underdeveloped to the benefits of the world of affluence and achievement. Perhaps this is the moment to instead bring home to the people of the US the knowledge that the way of life they have chosen simply is not alive enough to be shared. By now it should be evident to all America that the US is engaged in a tremendous struggle to survive. The US cannot survive if the rest of the world is not convinced that here we have heaven on earth. The survival of the US depends on acceptance by all so-called free men that the US middle class has made it. The US way of life has become a religion which must be accepted by all those who do not want to die by the sword or napalm. All over the globe, the US is fighting to protect and develop at least a minority who consume what the US majority can afford. Such is the purpose of the Alliance for Progress of the Middle Classes, which the US signed with Latin America some years ago. But increasingly, this commercial alliance must be protected by weapons which allow the minority who can make it to protect their acquisitions and achievements. But weapons are not enough to permit minority rule. The marginal masses become rambunctious unless they are given a creed or belief which explains the status quo. This task is given to the US volunteer, whether he be a member of CLASP or a worker in the so-called pacification programs in Vietnam. The United States is currently engaged in a three-front struggle to affirm its ideals of acquisitive and achievement-oriented democracy. I say three fronts because three great areas of the world are challenging the validity of a political and social system which makes the rich ever richer and the poor increasingly marginal to that system. All you will do in a Mexican village is create disorder. At best, you can try to convince Mexican girls that they should marry a young man who is self-made, rich, a consumer, and as disrespectful of tradition as one of you. At worst, in your community development spirit, you might create just enough problems to get someone shot after your vacation ends, and you rush back to your middle-class neighborhoods where your friends make jokes about spits and wetbacks. You start on your task without even any training. Even the Peace Corps spends around $10,000 on each Corps member to help him adapt to his new environment and to guard him against culture shock. How odd that nobody ever thought about spending money to educate poor Mexicans in order to prevent them from the culture of shock of meeting you. In fact, you cannot even meet the majority which you pretend to serve in Latin America, even if you could speak their language, which most of you cannot. You can only dialogue with those like you, Latin American imitations of the North American middle class. There's no way for you to really meet with the underprivileged, since there's no common ground whatsoever for you to meet on. Let me explain this statement, and also let me explain why most Latin Americans with whom you might be able to communicate would disagree with me. Suppose you went to a US ghetto this summer and tried to help the poor there help themselves. Very soon you'd be either spit upon or laughed at. People offended by your pretentiousness would hit or spit. People who understand that your own bad conscience push you to this gesture would laugh condescendingly. Soon you'd be made aware of your irrelevance among the poor, of your status as middle-class college students on a summer assignment. You would be roundly rejected, no matter if your skin is white, as most of your faces here are, or brown, or black, as a few exceptions who got in here somehow. Your reports about your work in Mexico, which you so kindly sent me, exude self-complacency. Your reports on past summers prove that you are not even capable of understanding that your do-gooding in a Mexican village is even less relevant than it would be in a US ghetto. Not only is there a gulf between what you have and what others have, which is much greater than the one existing between you and the poor in your own country, but there is also a gulf between what you feel and what the Mexican people feel that is incomparably greater. This gulf is so great that in a Mexican village, you as white Americans, or cultural white Americans, can imagine yourselves exactly the way a white preacher saw himself when he offered his life preaching to the black slaves on a plantation in Alabama. The fact that you live in huts and eat tortillas for a few weeks renders your well-intentioned group only a bit more picturesque. The only people with whom you can hope to communicate with are some members of the middle class. And here, please remember that I said some, by which I mean a tiny elite in Latin America. You come from a country which industrialized early and which succeeded in incorporating the great majority of its citizens into the middle classes. It is no social distinction in the US to have graduated from the second year of college. Indeed, most Americans now do. Anybody in this country who did not finish high school is considered underprivileged. In Latin America, the situation is quite different. 75% of all people drop out of school before they reach the 6th grade. Thus, people who have finished high school are members of a tiny minority. Then a minority of that minority goes on for university training. It's only among these people that you will find your educational equals. End quote. This seminal speech is quite long, so I entreat you to read its well-worded wisdom on your own. But I wanted to quote the ending to you. Illitch concludes, "If you have any sense of responsibility at home, stay with your riots here at home. Work for the coming elections. You will know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how to communicate with those to whom you speak. And you will know when you fail. If you insist on working with the poor, if this is your vocation, then at least work among the poor who can tell you to go to hell. It's incredibly unfair for you to impose yourselves on a village where you're so linguistically deaf and dumb that you don't even understand what you're doing or what people think of you. And it is profoundly damaging to yourselves when you define something that you want to do as good, a sacrifice, and help. I'm here to suggest to you that you voluntarily renounce exercising the power which being an American gives you. I'm here to entreat you to freely, consciously, and humbly give up the legal right you have to impose your benevolence on Mexico. I am here to challenge you to recognize your inability, your powerlessness, and your incapacity to do the good which you intended to do. I am here to entreat you to use your money, your status, and your education to travel in Latin America. Come to look, come to climb our mountains, to enjoy our flowers, come to study, but do not come to help." Sounds precisely like what Bunker Roy was telling me in India that wonderful long night over the wine bottle. And it's particularly relevant to students of climate disruption mitigation and adaptation and global sustainability. Students like you who really do want to make a difference. I put it this way: stop trying to think globally and act locally. You can't. The world is too big and is filled with people whose thoughts, being subaltern, are unfortunately likely to remain alien to your experiences of privilege. I'm not saying that you shouldn't visit others and share with them. Quite the contrary. Just don't presume to think for anybody. Nexus thinking, systems thinking, yes, these are holistic disciplines that seek to train our minds for global perspectives, but you simply can't think globally with any success. It should have read, attempt to think globally, try your damnedest to think both inside the box and outside your box. In fact, always strive to expand your box. But give up on thinking you can think globally and then parachuting for a few weeks into someone else's locale and trying to act locally. No, I reverse the adage. I say think locally and thereby act globally. You'd think it ridiculous for me to suggest you can personally act globally. You know that's impossible. You're too small and the world is too big. But somehow you accept that you can think globally, and that's also false, but seductive to the would-be hegemons and imperialists. No. Think locally. Think about your home, your neighborhood and community and region, and think about how to improve your locale. That is what Illitch is arguing, what Bunker was telling me. And then, by doing so and trusting that people are smart, and when empowered, quick to adopt what seems right and good, let them notice your success and local transformation. Share your successes and failures and let them share theirs, and watch and see how the ideas that are truly good, because they're life-tested by you, start to spread. That would be sustainability.